Hello, friends. It's wonderful. It's really wonderful to be here. My wife and I have been so warmly welcomed. We feel like it's coming home, being with dear, dear friends. I have to say, I think you're being cheated. Your time would be much better spent if we just listened to Rumi and Miranda. And also, another wonderful day would be just letting Habib speak extemporaneously for a day. I think you're getting just the smallest tip of what this man really is. He's been my dear, dear friend, my Shams, for nearly 30 years. And to me, he's a window into the universe. And all we got today was the Cliff Notes. So, well, my wife and I came here from Newtown, Connecticut. That's our home. We have had a singular experience in the last almost 11 months now. The year anniversary of that terrible shooting, which I don't have to explain to any of you, was in December of last year, December 14th. And we had just returned from Uganda after a very exhausting but wonderful and successful trip with our work there to the quiet town of Newtown, where we were expecting to just recuperate. My wife had been very ill, I had been ill, when we just were plunged into the horror that was visited on us. And ironically, my work as a psychiatrist for the last 30 years has been in traumatized environments, working in Bosnia and Croatia, setting up trauma responses for New York City after 9/11, in the Gulf region after Katrina, doing this work in Cyprus and Israel. I've had a chance to be to many of the places we heard about this morning. Spent a lot of time in Gaza and the West Bank. So everything everyone has already spoken about this morning resonates in my own experience, and I'm anxious to learn more from our previous speakers. I wanted to talk to you a bit about the realities of trying to implement change and transformation in a context that is highly traumatized. And I won't speak about Uganda, but I may pull in some examples. But Newtown, it seems to me, is a microcosm of the kind of dialogue, the kind of struggle we're all facing, living in the 21st century in a world that's greatly, greatly troubled, greatly confused, greatly anxious about the future. Recent polls have shown that people expect a calamitous event in the United States sometime within the next 6 months. 90% of Americans are expecting some cataclysm in the next 6 months. The climate, the tone of social discourse, of the world in which we live is becoming more and more frenetic. And the nature of my work has been to look at what is the effect that has on the way we relate to each other. How does it affect the way I identify as a human being and with you as another human being? And what are ways that we can hold the center, hold this notion of the drum that holds us, when all these forces are pulling us apart? And how can this notion of our wholeness and our oneness, this vision of enlightenment that we're all striving for, how can that be held when everything in us is screaming fear and anxiety and maybe even anger at what's happening around us? So there's so many things to tell you. Let's start with a simple idea. I want to just make a simple connection of two ideas before we move forward, and then tell you about what's going on in Newtown. I want to make an initial statement that our sense of identity defines the context within we view justice. We will not see something as just if it is outside of our identity. Now, what the heck does that mean? I was on a bus in Israel about 25 years ago, and we were working with it was a conference on political psychology. We were trying to figure out how the heck do we get out of this morass that's going on in the Middle East. And we were getting on a bus in a break in the conference, a colleague of mine, And I said to her, well, there's no hope for any kind of peace or justice here until we find a common identity, because that will define our notion of justice. And my friend said, huh? And so as we got on the bus, I said, our identity defines our sense of justice. And she said, well, I don't get it. And just at that moment, we were sitting down in the seats in the bus, and let's say I'm on the aisle and my friend's sitting at the window. And just as we sat down, a man was sitting down over here, and he hung his coat up on a hook over his window, but he couldn't see out the window. So he took his coat and reached over across us and said, excuse me, and he hung his coat up in front of us, so we couldn't see out our window. And I said, there it is. We're not part of his identity. So to him, it's perfectly fair to hang his coat up in front of us. He's not being mean. He's not being angry at us. We're just not in his circle of identity. So to him, that's a just act. It's unjust to us because we can't see out the window. So, if I had said to him at that moment, hey, move your coat, he might have said, well, I said, excuse me, what's your problem? So, and therein would be the problem. We could have narratives galore about whose right it was to sit where. It wouldn't have made any difference until he saw us as part of his identity, and we saw him as part of our identity, right? So the first task of conflict resolution isn't the narrative, because everybody's got a narrative of suffering. The first task is to reestablish, or maybe even establish for the first time, a common identity. That's the task. Now, here's the dilemma. As we suffer, our identity doesn't get bigger. It gets smaller, right? When I worked at a VA hospital, I was first brought to Harvard many years ago, and I was working at this hospital, and I thought, wow, this is great. Harvard University, all these doctors, all they want to do is save the world and do wonderful things, and we're going to do great work. And then I went into the hospital, and I found that the cardiology department, the head of the cardiology department actually ran the hospital. So he was siphoning money from everybody else, including the psychiatry department, to build this wonderful marble foyer in the cardiology department, because they were losing money hand over fist. And so our part of the hospital was falling in. I said, well, wait a minute. So my identity of being this Harvard doctor suddenly went, boom, I'm in this, I don't identify with the hospital anymore. I identify with my psychiatry department or mental health department. But then the psychologists and the social workers and the psychiatrists were all battling for the limited resources. So now my identity got smaller. We're against the social workers and the psychologists. But you know what? This other psychiatrist wants me to give the money for my clinic for PTSD over to his outpatient clinic, and now it's smaller. And then in my clinic, the social worker and the psychologist were trying to, battle for the limited, scant resources we had. So it's just me. And then I wasn't quite so sure about myself. So the trauma and the anxiety and the horror and all the things that we listen to. So I'm all fractured within myself. Right? So the point is, there's pressures on our identity to make them smaller and smaller with the stresses in life. So as our identity gets pushed smaller, our sense of what's fair goes with it. You can't create a world of peace unless you know how to manage that pressure, the inward pressure on identity. Does it make sense? All right, so now, Newtown. It's not a theoretical picture for my wife and I. It's very personal, intimately personal. We have come to know and love many people who've lost children. The town itself is, you can't go anywhere to get away from the story. You can't go to the store and forget about what happened, because there's memorials all over the place. There's signs that remind us of the tragedy, which is an appropriate thing to do, but it's a constant reminder of the pain, right? And unless you know how to manage the pain, there are some people in town who said, we've had it, that let's just kind of not talk about it anymore, And some of the families are saying, we'd like to be able to go to the store without being reminded of our son's loss, or that our daughter was cut in half by machine gun bullets, right? So, these things happen. So we're in kind of a mini lab, or a little laboratory, a little crucible that in a way represents the dilemma we're all in as a country and as a world. The stresses are getting more and more, right? So I want to talk about two trends that are, I'm going to call them brainstem reflexes, about how we deal with suffering. You've all heard of the fight or flight response. Anybody not heard? Everybody's heard of the fight or flight response. When we're threatened in any way, when things are uncertain enough that it makes us feel that our worldview is threatened in some way, that could be even a political thought, or someone's new ideas they're giving to us, all the way up to actually a tiger chasing us. Whenever we feel threatened, our fight or flight response kicks in, right? So what happens with the fight or flight response? Our body gets mobilized with adrenaline so that we can run from the tiger or fight it, right? So our body gets tense, and our heart rate increases, our eyes dilate. Emotionally, what happens in the brainstem is a part of the brain called the amygdala gets activated that directs us immediately towards one of two emotions that are our survival emotions. Fear and, what do you think the other one is? Fear and anger. Oh, it'd be great if it was love, but it's not. It's fear or anger, because you have to either be afraid of that tiger so that you stay focused on running away from it, or you've got to be as angry as possible so that you can fight it with all of your focused energy, right? So they're kind of evolutionarily smart, right? Fear and anger, because it keeps all, you can't just sort of say, oh yeah, I'll get to that tiger in a second, but no, if it's chasing you, you got to be really focused so you get out of the way, right? So that's what fear and anger do. They focus your thinking. And when adrenaline takes over your system and that emergency fear or anger take over, it hijacks your thinking. You're not thinking about, let's say you're playing a baseball game or something, the ball rolls out into the street and you run after it, and all of a sudden look up and there's a car coming at you, and your adrenaline kicks in and you become frightened. You're not thinking about who's rounding third anymore. You're thinking about, oh my God, there's a bumper coming at me, right? I got to get out of the way. Your thoughts get hijacked, and it's focused just on the threat, right? And thank God, because then you jump out of the way, car goes by, oh, did you see that? Oh my God, that's you. And it helps you think, well, next time I run into the street, I got to look both ways. So, and then eventually the adrenaline goes away and you can move on with your life. What's happening in Newtown, and I think in the country and in the world, is a derivative of what happens in the fight or flight response, carried on into the social world. If I can just explain that for a second. Having worked with veterans or survivors of war, or the families in Newtown, let's just stay with Newtown. You move to this lovely little town, you bring your kids and put them in the school there, because it's a great, safe place to raise your kids, and something like this happens. It's unspeakable. It's unspeakable. There are no words to describe the horror. We all felt it. And thank you for the tears and the good wishes and support that poured in from all over the world. They were very helpful for us. But suddenly, your worldview becomes destroyed. Let's say you have this notion that there's a compassionate God. Well, where was the compassionate God on December 14th, right? Or let's say you have the notion that people are ultimately good. Well, Adam Lanza clearly was not good that day. Maybe he had good days, but that wasn't one of them, right? So this sense of vision for the world can become destroyed. It can crumble, right? And your emotional life, which maybe your greatest emotional experience was some spiritual epiphany you may have had, but now your greatest emotional experience is horror, right? And it's much stronger than anything else you've kind of imagined, because it's a real horror, right? So now this ideal, this sense of purpose crumbles, right? And then with it goes your sense of capacity. I don't even know if I can make anything good happen in the world. Maybe you don't recognize yourself anymore, because I've never felt this kind of anguish before. I've never felt this kind of anger at the senselessness of life. And suddenly now your sense of who you are is changed, right? And now without a sense of vision and purpose, and without a sense of capacity, your willpower, which is the thing that connects the two, is gone. So you lose a sense of vision, a sense of capacity, and motivation disappear. And with that comes a sense of isolation, because you don't recognize yourself anymore. How do I explain my most intimate experience to someone else when my inner life is preoccupied with horror and unspeakable grief? This constellation of responses, a destruction of purpose, a loss of a sense of capacity, the fall and dissolution of motivation, and the sense of isolation that comes with it, I call that constellation of factors a weakened identity. It's not unique to Newtown. I think the whole world is in a state. Many people in the world are in that state, and it's characterized by despair, a lack of purposefulness, isolation, lack of motivation, lack of capacity, right? Now, that kind of response tends to follow those temperamentally who are geared towards the flight element of fight or flight. What happens on the other side? People more motivated towards the fight response. They're not so much thinking when something bad happens, well, what about my worldview and what happened to my world? You know, what happened with me that made this happen? They're thinking, what did you do? Why did you do this to me? So they're outwardly focused. You did this to me. Now, who's the you that did this? Right? And it's an angry outward focus, a projecting and blaming focus, right? So it's as if you take on a roulette table, you've got all your emotional investments. I've got 8 chips on being a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or a Buddhist or whatever, and chips on being a father and a mother or a brother or sister or a Democrat or Republican. You take all those emotional chips and you put them on one thing. Let's say the black 10 or the red 9 or something. And now you're a hyper whatever. A hyper Republican, a hyper Democrat, a hyper black, a hyper white. And now that's the good and everybody else is bad, right? So this rigidification of identity that has identified you did this to me and is very angry and motivated, unlike the despairing, weakened identity, what I call a rigid identity is highly motivated, very angry, and very much pointed at who's to blame, right? Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Does that sound like our political discourse right now? Mm-hmm. Does it sound just? No. So in this environment, when we're preoccupied with these brainstem instinctual responses that are generated by fear and anger, there is no critical thinking, right? There is no critical thinking. And there is no motivation that's healthy. There's either no motivation because there's no sense of purpose, or there's a distorted, perverse sense of purpose with people who are highly and angrily motivated. Make sense? What's the option? These things are generated from our brainstem. There are instinctual responses. But thank God we have another part of our brain. We have a cortex. And just jumping to Newtown, we started a group of kids called the Peace Builders. And these 11 to 14-year-olds, one of their mottos is, don't be a lizard. And what we mean by that, don't be a lizard, is don't be controlled by these two forces of anger and fear that wind up corrupting and undermining your relationships and your place in the world. We ask them to do another thing, to assume what we call a compassionate identity, right? Every single one of us is capable of a weakened or a rigid identity. Every single one of us is capable of fear that's inappropriate, that we bring into the current situation that isn't really appropriate, or anger that doesn't really suit the occasion, and we're hauling it in from our past and isn't appropriate. Every single one of us does that. It's the moment of choice. The moment of choice is when we feel that emotion, is when we say, no, this suffering isn't going to cause me to fall into despair and fear or anger and rigidity. I'm making the choice to see in this suffering how my experience unites me with you. It's my suffering that is your suffering. Your suffering is my suffering. We are one. This is my link to our common humanity. And the pathos, the tragedy of human existence, right? That this bond that unites us in suffering is the key. So we call that a compassionate identity. And we're at the point in human history where we're confronted constantly with stressors that are pulling us one way or the other towards this fear or anger, towards that weakened despair or that rigid extremism, and that anger and blame finger pointing. We need a movement that says, no, there's a choice. And the choice is the recognition of our common humanity and a sense of compassion. Our suffering must bring us to the point of our recognition of our common humanity and a sense of compassion. So in Newtown, we've been at this nonstop. Everything we've ever done in other parts of the world, we're now doing full-time right in our own front yard. So we've started a series of initiatives. One of them, we didn't start, it's actually the Interfaith Council, which my wife and I happen to sit on. And we're Baha'i, so we represent the Baha'i community there. Before this event, we were all respectful of each other, and it was very nice. But it was kind of, okay, you're okay, I'm okay, well, we won't infringe on your territory, and you leave us alone, and we'll leave you. It wasn't really a bond, right? When this happened, it's like the grief is so palpable and primal. It stripped away all the externals. Anything that would say that a theology made any sense or should be used as any kind of a barrier between us. All that stuff got stripped away. And I can honestly say it's the first time in my life where I've seen happen what we all hope to see, which is an interfaith community that genuinely loves each other and defends each other and stands up for each other and supports each other. And, we've gone to the mosque how many times? We've gone to the synagogue how many times? We've been to everybody's churches. And so that spirit of common aspiration is very much alive. And that's a whole story right there. That's one wonderful thing, because it's helping to set this tone of this choice that's encapsulated in a particular sign you see all over Sandy Hook. It says, "We are Sandy Hook, we choose love." And it's at that place in the history of the town where framing that statement, as trivial as it might sound, is life-saving, because it establishes the vision and the hope. So, but we're kind of in a race, because that vision's we've got to put wheels under that hope, right? Otherwise it can collapse. Unless we have visible, tangible examples that hope is alive, that vision is real, then cynicism and despair will creep in again, right? So we've been in this race to put in place initiatives that make it real. And one of them is the Peace Builders, these 11 to 14-year-olds who know that they need to not be lizards. Don't be a lizard, which are words to live by. The other motto of Peace Builders is, we're not waiting. And that means you don't have to be 15 to change the world. You don't have to be 18 or 20. You can be 11. You can be 12. You can be 13 or 14. Get out of the way. There's a world to change out there. These kids do not see that they are not world changers. They absolutely know that they are world changers. So they're out there in the community doing service projects, learning about each other's religions, learning about each other's backgrounds. It's a very diverse group of kids. And this group of 11 to 14-year-olds are one of the engines of hope in town, because everybody sees them and knows about them. The churches want to send their kids to them, the couple of schools and things. So it's become a magnet of hope. So keeping these kids out there, they don't know that they can't change the world, and we're not telling them any different. Right? So we're not talking about the trauma. We're creating a vision and helping kids move towards it. And that momentum, that movement generates hope in others, in adults. Another initiative, a similar project going on with the Unity Project that Margot and I started in the high school, where we're bringing a similar kind of service-oriented activity, strength-building activity, to create what we're saying as a generation of global citizens, that the response to this horror must be both exquisite beauty on the one hand, in the arts, let's say, but also noble global citizens, global citizens who are capable of living in a world with these tensions. So we got a similar project then in the high school. For adults, we started something called 21st Century Conversations, which is basically saying, do we really still have to talk to each other like it's the 1800s? Do we still have to talk to each other like there's one side and another, as if the world was two things, and that we fight each other over power? I mean, really? Can we do something different? Can we have a 21st century conversation? Can we explore what that might look like? Can we explore what a conversation might look like if we dampen the anger and the fear and choose compassion? If you think in a systems context, right, just tying this back to Bertalanffy and all the people who founded the idea of systems, our identity. The question came up before. Why should I not see myself as a Persian, Baha'i, or whatever? Why do I have to see myself as a whole first? I think an answer to that might be that if I were to lay out my liver, my kidney, my spleen, my lymphatic system, my brain, all on the table, and then I ask you to respect all of those parts of my body, well, that's kind of an odd academic exercise, isn't it? But once you know what a body is and what a body's capable of, well, then the liver makes sense, and you see its value, and you're anxious for its contribution to the whole, and you want to be sure that it harmonizes with the rest of the body, right? But our individuality and our separate, distinct identities only make sense in the context of a whole. So that's why. It's not that we say we give up our liver hood or our pancreas hood. It's that it only makes sense in a harmonized whole. So, let's see, where was I? Communication. So the way I would like to suggest that it's a very real crisis that we're in. As the tensions of the world increase, as our inability to navigate our wholeness takes on greater and greater consequence, environmentally, economically, socially, politically, as the consequences become greater for our failure to recognize our common humanity, the stakes get higher and higher. We feel more out of control, more afraid. That fear and that anxiety is pushing more weakened identities and rigid identities. So we have to very consciously create a movement that says the opposite. We must create and inhabit a compassionate identity, which means we also need to know how to communicate in a different way. When you are in a united group that recognizes the essential value of diversity, right, in a harmonic whole, in a system, it means you can communicate in different ways. In fact, it means you must communicate in different ways. You have to give up kind of the hierarchical structures of most communication in our political system, for instance, where one side has to dominate another to survive. That's the system we use now. It's a power-based system where identities are competing with each other. If we're in a harmonic whole, it means we need a different kind of problem solving, a different kind of style of communicating with each other, right? With the different assumptions about what the outcomes are. So it seems to me that your generation is challenged in a unique way. It's always been true that we've been one humanity. It's always been true that it would be better if we cooperated. But now the stakes are so much higher that unless we find ways to do it, unless your generation finds ways to become good at creating these systemic harmonies at larger levels, the stakes we're seeing now are nothing compared to what's coming. So I gave a talk to a bunch of kids yesterday up in Santa Monica, and we were talking about how, an astronaut is a person who goes into space, astronaut, to study the space. An aquanaut is someone who goes into the oceans to study the oceans. We need uninauts. We need explorers of the dynamics of unity who take it seriously and say that there are dynamics in human nature that are generated from our evolutionary background, from our brainstem, that direct us towards conflict, towards separate identities, and towards anger and fear. But we have a cortex that's largely unexplored. The social, harmonic, unific potential of the human brain is still undiscovered. Right? And so there is an evolutionary path that we're on that requires something other than 19th century thinking that we get in academia, right? So I welcome and invite you to start thinking of how do you systematize a process that can put in place ways to support people's choice for that compassionate identity when they're in the midst of this kind of heartbreak. Check out our Facebook page. Let's see, what do we got done? I'm trying to think of how you can follow us on Facebook or something with what's going on in Newtown. TheUnityProject.org, you can check that out. The site is down right now, but it'll be up soon. And maybe some of you want to do internships or something, come join us, or come to Uganda with us, and we'll see if we can bring up some of these efforts there. That's the work that the Unity Project is about. How do we explore the dynamics of unity, assuming that we don't know, that we need to learn as we go. And I think I need to be quiet because I'm seeing a question mark. So thank you, friends. I'm anxious to hear it. First part of the question was, has there ever been a time when humanity had these weakened and rigid forces in check, where there was this compassionate notion? And I would say there have been flashes of it, yes, and mostly in isolation, mostly in small settings, and the Pax Romana, I guess it was Pax, the peace in Rome, mostly because if you weren't, you got killed by the Roman Empire. But you can look at the Buddhist traditions and early Christian traditions where there were communities of that lived in relative peace. How does it get? Well, a couple points about that. I think we really are evolutionarily in our social evolution at a different stage, where the complexity of the application of it, the requirements are much greater. Where it's one thing if I live in a monastery, let's say, and have a sense of peace in my own life, but I don't interact with the world, right? Or I only see people who are just like me. Right? So I might say, oh, we're peaceful because we're civilized, but we're not letting the barbarians in, right? So the time we're in now, there's no walls. It's us. There's no them. So I really think we're blazing a trail in human social evolution, maybe biological evolution as well. So I don't think it's ever happened. So that number one. Number two, we were talking about critical thinking before. And the hidden word that was read so beautifully, the statement of Baha'u'llah, I think really maybe captures it. That one of the things that happens when you're either working on fear or anger is your thinking, remember I said is hijacked? Your thinking becomes focused on what they call stereotypic patterns. That's the psychological phrase for it. You are rehearsing habitual patterns of survival, right? So think of a bunch of kids in a fifth grade class or something where they're in various degrees of humiliating each other in the playground. They come in and into the classroom, and now they're supposed to learn, but really they're caught up in this social dynamic of threat, mutual threat and humiliation, where there's these pecking orders and things. So it's not really a mind that's free to take in new information and learn. So as long as there's this sense of threat in the environment that you don't know how to manage, there's this sense of defensiveness and rehearsal of patterns that keep you safe. So the focus is on safety and not on creating unity or creating a sense of common growth, right? So most of the patterns of our thinking in the world anywhere are geared towards protection, geared towards safety, survival of the fittest. And I would suggest that if we lower the sense of threat in our environment, new possibilities, new ways of communicating and problem solving emerge, but only to the degree to which we create that sense of safety, which means fundamentally this notion of enlightenment being the kind of the basis, the foundation of democracy, I think is really very valid, because we will only create the social dynamics and the political systems that reinforce our inner world. I mean, there is no separation between these things. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit. Whatever the intervention that you choose for your own life's work, it essentially are the three that I think Mr. Riazati pointed out to. For a sustained social transformation to occur, change has to happen on three levels at the same time. They must happen here, internally. I must be able to recognize the automatic patterns, the blind imitations, you might say, or the habitual habits of thinking, habits of feeling, habits of behaving that I engage when I am either afraid or angry. I need to be able to reflect on those objectively without bias and just simply acknowledge them. Otherwise, I have no chance of being free from them. Right? So I must first be able to reflect on them and acknowledge those patterns in my own thinking. I then need to be able to step back and see systemically. What is the system here really telling me? What actually are the components of this environment that this problem is embedded in, right? And only then, once I've kind of emptied the cup, as was said earlier, of my own bias, seen the complexity of and the systemic whole of the context of the problem that I'm looking at, only then can I really look with a searching eye into the particulars of how to solve that particular problem in an objective way, that I have any hope of really solving the problem and not just adding more problems to an already existing conflicted situation. So the first is at this personal level. The second is interpersonally. Oh, and by the way, I call that first level fair-mindedness. Someone mentioned that this morning. I think it's exactly the right word. In Arabic, it's insaf. Right? And the second level would be, how am I now with you? Right? How do I interact with you? The sense of equity. How do we engage in developing greater and greater degrees of equity, where we all are at that common humanity is respected and takes form in the form of equal liberties and rights. Equal liberties and rights. And that's equity. The third is the institutional level, which is institutional justice. So unless these three realms, these three domains are in interactive harmony, there is no such thing as sustainable change. So I would suggest that the next 100 years at least of human evolution, assuming we can make it through this next 100 years, are going to be tugs between systems that are based on limited identities, that are trying to maintain power, and new systems that are evolving that are in this harmonic form. And I think there's no way for it to be done without turmoil. I think turmoil is an inevitability. So we have to be able to manage personally that turmoil with equanimity. That's a long answer. Could I explain human nature and human aggression, basically? Human aggression? No, I can't. And I'm being a little bit flippant because it's a vast subject that I don't claim to entirely understand. Other than to say that it really appears as if we have two natures. Our brain can be divided in many ways, but basically it functions in two ways. The reptilian brain and parts of the diencephalon and the midbrain are largely responsible for keeping us alive and protecting us from threats. The survival of the fittest brain, right? That a part of it being this fight or flight response, other parts of it being keeping our biorhythms moving, our circadian rhythms, our sexual reproductive rhythms, all of the, breathing, body temperature, regulating all those primal functions. The problem is when our cortex is directed by that part of the brain, right? It seems when we're born, our reptilian animal brain is in full force. All of its genetic capacity is at full swing, right? For our survival, right? So the anger and the appetites and the fear and all the things that keep us alive physically are in full force. And all of our socialization capacity is there potentially, but largely undeveloped, right? There's an interesting science behind that, but that's a long subject. And it seems like life is about getting this part of the brain, the cortex, to develop, to start dampening this part of the brain so we can have relationships. Because it turns out the older you get without having learned how to dampen your anger and your fear in this part of your brain, the more unsuccessful your relationships are, right? Think about it. If your relationships are filled with fear and anger, who wants to be with you, right? I don't want to, you might be a lovely person, except I can't live with you, right? So we need to learn how to dampen. And I think there's a lot of pop psychology that says just be real, be angry, if you're angry, just get it out. I think that's really dumb. You know, it's really, really dumb. It's sort of creating you know, an entitlement mentality that says that every emotion I feel just needs to be gratified. Well, yeah, you can live that way, but then you wind up being an isolated jerk, you know, that nobody wants to be around. So it's if there's something that makes us angry or afraid, it means that there's an injustice we need to use language with in a harmonic way with someone else to solve the problem. It doesn't mean we need to just vent our emotions. It means we have to problem solve in a harmonic, loving way, right? So the emotion is a signal to problem solve in a just way, not to just indulge your emotion, right? See what I mean? So that part, I don't know, how did I get on this? That's a big issue. And somebody else? Or is that it? I've had way too much coffee. That's the